Get started recording this. Hi everyone, my name is Nicole Kraft and I am the director of Ohio State's Sports and Society Initiative. Our goal is to recognizing that Ohio State is the leader in sports, and I know that one of our panelists may dispute that because she's from Penn State, but we are certainly a leader in sports, and so we want to be a leader in the dialogue around sports and the research around sports as it intersects with society. So we hold programming monthly, and we're thrilled that you could be here for this, which is really the most prominent and public launch of our autumn season. And our goal is to bring together important voices, people who are in the know, people who have experiences that we can all learn from, to talk about key topics that are important to all of us. So today we're going to talk about women and sports and social media, which is presents its own unique set of challenges. At the end of the month, we'll be bringing you Mind Games, which is a look at athletics and mental health and the challenges that COVID-19 have brought. So we hope that you'll go to sportsandsociety.osu.edu and check out our programming and sign up for that. But right now I'd like to welcome our panelists. If they could join us, I am excited to present them to you. We have three exceptional women who are in sports media and one exceptional woman who's going to help us understand online dynamics and why we experience some of the things that we do when we can hide behind the online environment. So first I'd like to welcome Allison Lucan, who is with The Athletic. She is I call her the hockey data queen because no one knows data better than Allison does. I'd also like to welcome Emily Kaplan, who's a New York City blogger and a sports writer. I'm looking at ahead here. She is the ESPN hockey reporter. We have New York City blogger and sports writer Erica Ayala. And then Jessie Fox, my colleague here at The Ohio State University, whose specialty is social media and online personas. And we're thrilled that you guys could all join us. Again, a reminder that we do have the questions open and we want you to submit them. So please put your questions in early and often. And then you can upvote questions. So if there's something that someone else has put out there that you want to hear especially, please give us an upvote and we'll know about asking those. So we are thrilled that you could be here and be part of this. So I'm going to start with showing you a tweet. So let me share my screen briefly. And it may be something that is familiar to my good friend, Allison. So let's take a look here. All right. Hang on, just pulling over too many windows here. All right, so Allison, you had a tweet that looked like this. Do you remember this?
I'm keenly aware of this tweet.
Okay, so this is a tweet, of course, and sometimes playing on Zoom can be difficult, but
it's a terrific environment with regards to if you enjoy playing and enjoy being with your teammates for long periods of time, it's a perfect place. Not even any woman here to disrupt their concentration.
Okay, so with that statement, Mike Milbury, not for the first time, stuck his foot in his mouth. And you tweeted out your thoughts about that, which were actually pretty simplistic. Now, I followed you on that tweet by sending out this, which I will open up for you all. Move this down. So I sent this out, which said misogyny was alive and well in the NHL broadcast booth. And then I very quickly started to get some responses. So this one was pretty nice, I thought. It wasn't overly unfriendly, and I kind of got his point. But then they certainly transcended what I would have considered to be the taste that my father would have liked to be reading. I'm horrible, self-righteous, and then I should lose my job. This one was a little bit more general about women in general, about saying things. This is my absolute favorite after I was on a radio show in Boston that I got cut off after 2 minutes and 19 seconds, but I was called a vile hag, which, is actually, I think I'm going to make that my new Twitter profile. And in the end, Allison, I know you had far more than this, but this tweet got 600, it actually got more than this, but when I captured this, 613 impressions. So I'd like for us to try to understand how this happened. So we had one tweet that went out and went absolutely crazy. How does this happen? And maybe, Jessie, can you start and tell us how this happens?
Sure. So one thing that's kind of different about the social media environment is that things are more visible. So in nerd speak, we call these affordances, but they're characteristics of the environment that are different from face-to-face communication. So if you've been quoted in a lantern saying the same thing, then only people who are reading the Lantern are going to see that. On social media, though, people have this opportunity to take what you say and share it and retweet it and reply to it. So it's more interactive, and it gets so much more like widespread views and so forth. So it could go viral, things can be seen, which gives an opportunity for an audience that normally wouldn't see those things to kind of weigh in. So that's where we start in terms of who's seeing this stuff. And why are they behaving this way? Well, it's mostly because online there are very few consequences for our actions. Some people say it's about anonymity, but really it's more so, because people do post things under their own names. They're just not worried about any blowback from it. So that's why they feel free to just speak hatefully.
So I imagine, Emily, Erica, and Allison, that you got into sports writing for the same reasons I did, because we like sports and we're good at it, right? Like, we know a lot about sports and we've been doing this for a while, but I don't see men getting the kind of response that women get in general. And Emily, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your journey and when you started realizing that maybe being exposed as a sports writer and being a woman was going to open you up to vitriol that you didn't expect.
It's fascinating. And firstly, I will self-identify as the lone Nittany lion here, but I come as an ally. I come in peace. What's wild with Jesse?
Big Ten, we're all right.
It's collaborative. What Jesse said really struck a chord about the visibility of a tweet, because sometimes if something goes viral, people don't necessarily follow you, know what you're about, know all of your context and nuance. They just see that glimpse, and that glimpse for them is a lightning rod that they want to comment on. I've seen it. And you guys will get a kick out of it, 'cause it's Pennsylvania anecdote. The first time that I really started feeling this ugliness online was when I was an intern at Penn State writing for the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I started reading the comments on my stories and the replies to my tweets. And they were the most innocuous stories. Christian Hackenberg comes to visit Penn State. He's a top prospect. You slut, go back to where really disgusting, unnecessary things. And I just feel like sometimes as a woman, you carry this burden of having to prove yourself all the time. And unfortunately, you also carry men's burdens. And one anecdote just today, I have one male colleague, and he said something online that I personally didn't agree with. And he was getting a lot of hate for it. He was making fun of the spelling of somebody's last name. It was xenophobic. It's, that's not a cool joke to make, that's somebody's identity. It's what they were born with. And somebody tweeted at me and said, "You're complicit in this. You're laughing along." And I'm like, I had zero interactions with this whatsoever. I just let him be. And it almost just feels like we're being asked sometimes to fight every fight. And, for four of us, that's a lot of fight. For Erica, that's even bigger fight. You carry a lot more burdens than us. So I give you all the credit in the world.
Well, Erica, that's a great dovetail to this. And, you do carry a bigger burden. And I'm guessing you haven't played professional sports. I don't know. It's just a guess that you haven't played professional hockey or football, as we all get thrown at us at some point. What has your experience been, and kind of how do you navigate these waters?
Sure. So I do think my experience is, and probably has been different. But I think some of that, at least, if not all of that, is because I write almost exclusively about women's sports. And the interactions that I have just by being like, hey, there's a women's hockey game on. I mean, first of all, it's just, that is just wild in and of itself. To see the reactions. But I also think that the interactions that I have with fans online sometimes are on the opposite side of the spectrum, wherein I'm being critical or analyzing a particular athlete or team, as analysts sometimes do. And I'm having to explain, why I can't just be grateful and be thankful that someone won an award and not maybe mention why someone else was also deserving. So that's kind of where I come from. But I think if I'm deducing what Emily was inferring to, also that I am Black Latina in hockey in particular, which can be a very white space, when I do engage with hockey as a whole and not just women's hockey, especially in 2020 and I'd say the year or two before, because there are a lot more conversations about race and racism and homophobia and stuff. And when I do engage in those types of conversations, yes, it's a little bit different as someone who is BIPOC. You know, I identify again as Black Latina, but I also think, although I never played professional sports, I was a college athlete, and I maybe take the Sarah Spain approach. I'm like, you know, if you are going to engage on my Twitter timeline, I'm going to engage back. I was also raised by a lawyer, so I sometimes just let people know I'm here for the debates. But what we're not going to do is insult my intelligence. But happy to hear your take and to defend mine. But what I don't do is engage in you know, just lazy takes of taking the easy and cheap shots.
You know, Allison, it feels like that there's certain roles that women are allowed to do in sports, right? Like we're allowed to be sideline reporters. Although, you know, then there's all kinds of comments about how you dress and how close you stand and all this other stuff. But, you know, what is it about the podcasting or the writing or the actual, you know, active engagement that goes beyond our stereotypical roles that seems to set certain viewers on edge?
Yeah, I don't know. I wish I knew. Jesse probably is smarter on this than me. But I think back even to when I first started writing and I got into this business later, I think, than everyone here. I was already doing a job in corporate America, and I had been writing on the side, and I was finally getting paid to write. But I was told by my male editor that I could not write about hockey. I could not even do player profiles. I had to do community service. I had to do what we call fluff pieces. And I loved those stories, don't get me wrong, but I was restricted from writing about the game. And people have asked me why. I'm a heavily analytically focused writer, for those who don't know. And as I've talked with people, I came to realize that I did that in part because I love that side of the world and I love thinking about the game that way. But also it was a defense, because if I made one error, if I couldn't be sure that I knew what I was thinking, I was just going to get ripped to shreds. And the numbers gave me a backup because I was being attacked so much that it was like, look, these are the numbers. And that was another kind of driver for me to become the kind of writer that I was. I don't know if it's intimidation. I don't know where the anger comes from. There's that meme that goes around, you know, this isn't pie. There's not a limited amount of space for all of us. And I don't, that's what's really hard for me to understand.
I hear you. You know, Jesse, maybe I'm naive and that, you know, please tell me, but I find it hard to believe that there's, you know, so many people out in the world that if given the face-to-face opportunity would call me a vile hag or the C word, which I was called, and I'm sure, has anyone else been called the C word online in the last year? Yeah. Okay. So, you know, these things that we do not say in normal company, I mean, they're, you know, it's just not something that you would ever hear in the world, but yet online, it's not only accepted, it's commonplace. What is it about this freedom that we get? And people, they have their pictures on there. It's not like we can't see them. And some even have their names. Why do they feel like this level of venom is not only acceptable, but really appropriate?
Well, there's a couple of layers to it. And one thing, you know, talking about gender and talking about intersectional identities, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, all these things come into play because sports is seen traditionally as a, you know, heterosexual male domain, and certain sports like hockey, also a white domain. So you definitely see where people's identities are coming at play here. And there is this idea of protecting your identity, that it's not just about sports, but that sports is a man's place. Like, this is something, I have my man cave and I do my man thing and I invite my man friends over and we get all emotional about sports. So, you know, that's really what it's about, is emotional expression probably. But that with that comes that defense of women don't belong in this space. So we see the same thing in video games and so forth, that this is a male domain and you're not invited in. So because of that, there's going to be that knee-jerk reaction Like Emily said, just seeing her byline, seeing a name like Emily on something is going to get that knee-jerk reaction. Like, what does a woman have to say about this? This isn't her space. She can't possibly know as much as I do, because they feel threatened by this. And this is a space that they want to, it's their safe space, so to speak, where they want to be a certain way and behave a certain way. And when women come in, we ruin it because we hold them accountable to like not saying sexist garbage and things like that, which are racist garbage. And they don't want to necessarily be held to those standards. They want this to be their free space. And so it's always a defense, not just of what's happening, but of that social identity and that space for them. And that's why it's kind of a universal hostility to any woman who comments, whether it's a random person or a sports writer or whatever the case may be, so that they want to hold on to that space. The second part is they get rewarded for it. So they are hoping, just like any desperate little social media user, I want likes, I want rewards, I'm going to get all the little likes from all the other, misogynists out there. So that is also a thought in the back of their mind, that they're going to get elevated in their position as a man by being hostile towards women. So those things, that intersection makes it particularly vitriolic online. If someone says something to you like on the street, no one's like, he's not going to stand there with his hand up and people are going to walk by and give him high fives. He's not going to get that social approval. So that's the other kind of dangerous part about social media.
That's the truth. In some ways, I think I could live with this if it was only online. But I show my students regularly the clip of Cam Newton, who found it incredibly humorous when a female reporter asked him about routes. I think, I don't, raise your hand if you've been in a locker room where you've been made to feel uncomfortable at any point in your career. Maybe Erica, you could talk a little bit with us about what it's like to be immersed in sport. Like, do you feel the same level of, danger comes to mind, but just that you're being judged for being a woman, even when you're immersed in the coverage of the sport itself?
Yes. I mean, I'm struggling because yes doesn't even seem like enough, but yes, I think, again, most of the time I am covering women's sports, but also most of the time I'm working with men. And I also have to interact with men to offer media credentials, for example. And I think that as a woman, but especially as a Black woman, I think that even the engagement sometimes with PR or with teams, I've noticed that it's different, and sometimes it's different just based on the publication that I write for, which in some ways I suppose makes sense, but it's still my work, still my byline. So I think it's just really difficult to find comfort when the people that you are requesting access from are maybe making some assumptions about how you do your work or if you can do your work. Then you go into the press box or the media area, and there are already clusters of people who know each other. And especially as a freelancer, who I don't have that necessarily consistent protection, if you will, from a specific outlet or organization. Every time I go in there, it is just me. It's my name, quite literally, that I carry. And I think that there is all kinds of different levels and layers of privilege, and thus separation that is created in this media space. And I've always fallen on the intersection of a lot of those. So it's difficult. And again, as someone who mostly covers women's sports, not only, I find it in that space as well. And that is extremely frustrating.
I hear you. We have a question here from Peggy Siegel, Emily, about what greenlights the triggering of grievances against women covering sports? Is it the athletes who we cover, male reporter colleagues, the fans, all of the above? What do you think?
I honestly don't know. Like, that's the thing that I think triggers me the most, is that I don't understand the motivation for a lot of it. It honestly feels subjective sometimes, of what things they want to comment on and why, what things they say about me and why and when. And just to the point earlier about what it's like being in the environment of sports in real life in normal times. And you guys will have to excuse me, they decided to do some construction on my street. But if anyone's seen the movie Concussion about Dr. Bennett Amalu, CTE was explained, in my opinion, the best simplistic way possible. And it's not one huge hit that concusses someone and creates these proteins in the brain to activate. It's a bunch of small subconcussive hits that happen again and again and slowly build up. And for me, that's online. I get the big concussive hit, right? You get called a cunt, you get called whatever. But in real life, and it's online too, it's more of the casual misogyny. It's things people say without thinking about it. It's things that are just inherently sexist, where they will go along in their day. And look, this happens from colleagues too. This happens from pretty much any end of the spectrum of anyone you interact with. And eventually it just grates on you and you question your self-worth. And I think, and I know I'm not answering your question, Peggy, and my apologies. I guess I just went on a bit of a rant, but I think the biggest issue I have, is when I get critiqued, is it makes me question myself. And I'm still finding my voice. I'm young in this industry. I'm still navigating. And sometimes it's hard for me to put myself out there. And when I do, and I should be proud of it, I then question, and there's a voice in my head saying, was I out of line? Was I not qualified to make that comment? Whatever it might be. And I hate that, because it should only be about my conviction, my boss's convictions, my employer or whatever. And instead I'm getting anonymous trolls that are, creeping into my thought processes.
Allison, yes.
Yeah, Nicole, I think, and with the Mike Milbury situation being quite fresh, when it was just exploding, I'm not going to make a sweeping statement and say all men, but almost all of my female and diverse crowd of friends and colleagues were speaking up about the instance. The definitive piece was written by Katie Strang, a woman, but we didn't see a lot of male voices elevating the challenge. I think that we see that a lot. We will see men be irate about a quarterback benching or a tweet from an agent, and it will be subject on every podcast, on every news broadcast. But I was watching very carefully, obviously for personal reasons, how the Milbury situation was covered. For those who don't follow hockey, he did leave the broadcast. Major national broadcasts, podcasts, and articles did not even mention this. And then I think we have an issue. We have a coach who was let go from the Toronto Maple Leafs earlier this year, in part because of some emotional abuse. Now, this isn't a gender-related issue specifically, but we didn't see male colleagues challenging if that issue had been addressed. And I do think it's incumbent upon our male colleagues, particularly our white male colleagues who, through millions of reasons and hundreds of years, own the power structure here, to pay attention to these issues, support women, support people of color, support minorities of all diversities when this stuff arises, because that is in part why these people, as Jesse said, look for the likes, look for the validation. No one with what they deem as authoritative power is saying, no, that's not okay. And until that happens, every woman, every person of color, every LGBTQIA person can be speaking out about something, but if the people with power don't speak out about against it, it's not ultimately going to matter. So yes, white men need to speak up more, period.
And I do want to credit, we both noticed Jean-Luc Grandpierre, who of course, former Blue Jacket, who is a broadcaster now, he did jump into the fray to defend you. And I was warmed by that because I'm a big admirer of his. But, Jesse, that brings up a great question. Why don't men who are in power defend or shoot this down? Like, why? It's because, I think all of us have male colleagues that we find that are incredibly supportive of us, that are, no matter what circumstance, we could count on them to do anything to help us. But when it comes to that environment that you are now the subject of such vitriol, well, I got plenty of comments behind the scenes, but I didn't get anybody out front who was like, this is ridiculous. And so what is it that stops our male colleagues with power from getting in this space and being heard?
So part of it is the shared identity with the people who are, making these comments. Part of it is public relations concerns, maybe especially for particular professional athletes, agents stepping in and being like, I know how you feel about this, but don't. Also, there have been visible examples of people who have become allies and been outspoken and they get shut down. We have our Colin Kaepernicks, we have our Chris Clues, we have people like that who have stepped up and kind of become vocal and really defended people, and then they bear the weight of that punishment. And so when you see that behavior modeled and see people get punished for that, because even an athlete speaking out is not in power of their own position. And we saw that with Kaepernick getting kind of shut out by all these teams despite his talent, because he chose to speak out on issues related to Black Lives Matter. And then again, like when we see people talking about gender, they're like, okay, I don't want to do that. Or, well, if I lose more fans and I lose followers on Twitter, there's going to be a downstream effect and I'm going to lose sponsorships. I'm going to lose money. And so, there are many deterrents to keeping them from doing that. That said, we as women and people of color cannot keep doing this work. It's already, as Emily mentioned, that everyday sexism. There's a term called racial battle fatigue, because every day you are fighting that fight. It's draining, it's emotional, you're questioning yourself, and the psychological toll of just doing our jobs is complicated constantly by these identities. And so we need people who have the capacity to take that on to also step up. And the third thing is they're going to reach audiences we can't listen to. So as women, we are always going to be shut down. People are just not going to listen to us no matter how much we stand behind each other. You have to have that allyship from other people, and particularly people who look like the people who are being critical. So we need white men to stand up and do this, be vocal, be supportive, and change the power structure. Unfortunately, there are disincentives because there are usually someone higher up who is going to possibly take that out on them. And I think too, we have to acknowledge that that's part of these situations, and that it may be difficult, that people may want to say something and be constrained from doing so, which is other forms of inequity and power.
What advice do you guys, and maybe Emily, you could start, I do know that the first person I called when it started to roll downhill on me was Allison. So, I think that's a natural reaction for us, is to reach out to those who support us and believe in us and understand where we're coming from. But what would you say to women who are in this position or could be faced with this position before it happens? How would you kind of counsel them? And Courtney's asking about, the potential of a mentorship program for women. So maybe we can talk about that too. But I'm curious how you would help some other young person who wants to get involved in this, knowing what's coming.
Well, firstly, I love the friendship that you guys have in that relationship. And this is something that I didn't learn until later in my 20s, but the power of female relationships is everything. A lot of us who are in sports, we're tomboys. We probably get along with the guys. Most of our friends are guys, and they're great. And I have the best guy friends. But I never understood the power of a female friendship and finding someone who is like-minded in your industry where you can feel seen until my late 20s. And it's incredible. And my person is this girl named Isabel, and she covered the Capitals for the Washington Post. And I just, and it's any little things where, like I said, if a colleague says something that's the casual misogyny. One thing I want to build off of Jesse's thing is when we ask the white males to speak up, one thing I am wary of is performative speaking up. And just, I call them, performative, feminists, fake feminists or faux feminists, where they'll say some things and it's because it's the right. And I think a lot of times they're seeking that like and gratification and that fake currency that comes on social media, but behind the scenes, they don't walk the walk or talk the talk. And then the other piece of advice besides the female friendship and just finding someone who can see you in that authentic way is just to try to ignore it the best you can. And I talked earlier of how I allow some of these things sometimes to creep into my confidence. And that's a really ugly and slippery slope place to be. You really just have to mute it out the best you can. You hear so many people, the Katie Nolans of the world, the Sarah Spains, the women who are really visible, talk about muting their mentions or filtering it to only see people they follow. And it can be addictive, and I search my name sometimes and I never like the results. So why do it?
Yes. Erica,
Once in a while, I'll see something nice.
yeah, I remember when Allison said, I said, well, I blocked them. She goes, don't block them, mute them. So let them keep talking into the wind. Erica, what would you say?
I would say be yourself, unapologetically. I mean, there are just so many things that have come up from even just the few minutes that we've been talking that have really resonated with me. But as I mentioned, I kind of take, and I jokingly said the Sarah Spain approach, but I don't mute people and I don't block people. That's just not how I operate. I'm here for debate and discussion. And I think honestly, the approach that I take is I ask a lot of questions. I guess that's my mom being a lawyer is, well, why do you feel this way? Why are you calling me this? Why does this take upset you? Don't you think that we should debate and have conversation about who is the most valuable player or who's the defensive player of the year? Isn't that what we do in sports? Like, why is this bothering you? So I ask a lot of questions, and maybe I just have too much time on my hands, which is definitely not true. But I think for me, and I think it's something that was mentioned earlier, as far as like this battle fatigue, right? I don't know if maybe my tolerance is just high, or maybe it's just that I feel that, if I don't defend myself in these spaces for myself, but also for others, then it never gets any better. And I don't have the luxury in some ways of seeing the world as someone who is white, because I've never been that. I can't experience that. But similarly, someone who is white or who doesn't identify as a Black Latina as I do can't be expected to see the world as I do. And so if I make assumptions that anyone who is, clapping back or coming at me on social media, particularly with those two identifiers, I'm assuming that they don't know what it is to identify the way that I do. So that's when the clarifying questions come in, and using facts to really build my case. And more often than not, whether they're an anonymous egg or not, I can get a person to a place where they step back from the personal attacks. And then in that case, I'm fine if you think that my take is wrong. I happen to really like it. So once we get over all of that ugliness, then we're fine and we're just people. So again, I know that approach isn't for everyone, but I do think it is important to honor and validate people who do take that approach, because we all need that, right? We all need people who, regardless of if they identify the way that we do or not, to kind of stand up to the conversations as they happen on social media, because 280 characters is not a lot. It's not a real conversation. And so I like to challenge just kind of even the norm of being able to, anonymously or not, just spew such hate and vile things in such a short little tweet. I'm not here for that.
It's impressive what they can fit into 280 characters. Allison, what would you say?
Well, I'm getting insight into why Erica is one of my very favorite interviewers and moderators in the world. I could not agree more with the points that Emily and Erica have made. And the only thing I will add, and I don't mean to be a downer, is as women, take care with what you share, take care with what you present. I was shocked with the Mike Milbury thing at the variety of channels with which people found me to deliver targeted harassment. And that was scary. I'm not going to lie. And so to Erica's point, being yourself and knowing what you're comfortable sharing, what you're comfortable knowing, as Jessie said, is out there for anyone, be it contact information, address information, channels that you share on other channels. I've shared this before, for example, Instagram is my safe space. So I'm private there. That's me. And I think that unfortunately the realities today are that if you're going to be in this space, or a space where you're fighting for equality, which is a lot of spaces, do take care and do have protections and avenues in place should you need to pursue a greater degree of protection than you've already tried to provide yourself.
Absolutely. You know, Jesse, as I'm listening to this, I can't help but ask two questions. So I'll start with the first one. Does it work to challenge? I mean, Erica is so gifted at challenging people and helping, hopefully, to open their minds. But is that, generally speaking, an effective way to deal with people who reach out with such hostility?
So, absolutely it can be. So, the whole changing hearts and minds is true. Sometimes it takes that one conversation to challenge someone. Like, if you intervene at the right point and they're like, well, I've never really done this before. No one's ever, clapped back at me. And then they do, it might make people reconsider their behavior. If not their attitudes, at least their behavior. But self-reflection is always good. I'm kind of like Erica in the way that, when I get hostile emails, I actually use a canned message. So because I think we have to balance that with the time and labor that it costs to kind of do those sorts of things. So I just have a canned message that I send back that's like, hey, you're a human, like I'm a human. I didn't want to get this message. I don't know what's going on in your life that makes you feel this way or makes you feel like you need to talk to someone this way. But, I'm worried about you and I think you maybe need to get some help. And, I would encourage you not to talk to anyone this way especially someone you've never even met online, like it's just not cool. So I try to humanize them in that way. And that's one thing, it's online. It's so easy to dehumanize someone, like the anonymous egg, like Erica said, right? It's easy to dehumanize that person. And they just know you by this little teeny tiny avatar. They don't know you as a person. Or they think they do because they have some image based on your persona that you are online, which is not usually a full picture of who you are. So, it can be a successful technique for people. Of course, with millions and millions of people, that can be a lot of time and effort. So that's, teach their own. If that's how you feel and it's working for you, great. I think that is good and it can persuade some people. But of course, for some people, if that's not working or you realize it's a time suck and it's just taking all that time, think about your male colleagues who are not spending that time, who don't have to do that all the time, like because they can pick and choose. They don't have to worry about defending their reputations or trying to change people's behavior about women because as women, we feel this pressure to like fix the world. They're doing other things with their careers, or maybe they're just chilling out in the hot tub, which you don't have time to do, So like we have to think about those kind of group costs. So did that answer your question, Nicole?
I just wanted to follow up on that just with an anecdote. Firstly, that canned email was like the best advice I've heard in some time, because you're right. One of the things that I think frustrates me the most is how much bandwidth all of this takes, of how much we're thinking about it, stressing about it, when think of how much more productive we could be in our personal and professional lives if we weren't dealing with this extra burden. But the approach of replying and not replying, and like, Erica, I think you're a badass and I think you are awesome. And like, I am so envious that you can clap back at these, I'm assuming men, but trolls, we'll just call them, and do it in an intelligent way. Back in the day, I would try it and I sometimes had success. I remember there was one time, and I can't remember the incident, where I replied to someone and they were like, wow, I didn't think you would actually reply. I'm sorry. Because they didn't view whatever communication we had as an actual valid communication between human and human. It was just more of this computer be a computer. But then I will compare that to another situation that I dealt with. And it was when I first began podcasting. I believe it was when I was at Sports Illustrated covering football. And there was a man who replied to me every single day with a frog emoji, because he said my voice sounded like a frog. And I remember once asked, and then he would say, you can get voice lessons, all this stuff. And I was thinking about it, and then this is my voice. Like, this is what I was born with. And I understand I have vocal fry. I'm a millennial woman. What you're pretty much saying is you don't like the sound of a woman's voice. It's not my voice specifically. It's a woman's voice. And I remember, and as best as I could in 280 characters, one day I had enough. Every single day I was seeing these frog emojis or some kind of lesson about the frog. And I replied to him, I think in whatever clap back I could, like, hey, this is my voice. I can't change it. If you don't like it, don't listen. And I remember, I'll never forget, I was so proud of this response. And he replies back, yeah, but you still sound like a frog. So my point is no matter what, sometimes you're not going to be able to change either. I don't think you'll be able to change beliefs very easily, but not even behaviors either. And that can be demoralizing. And I think that's why I take the approach of trying not to fight, because you never know who's going to take it and who's not. And in my experience, most don't.
It's funny as I think about the evolution of this, and I may be the oldest person here, I'd be okay with that. But when I was working in professional sports in the 80s, it was isolated to the locker room, or it was isolated to the press box, whatever experience you had. And in truth, if you wanted to just write with your initials, or, whatever you would do to just, put a mask on, you could get away with that. And there was less judgment. But now, like you just mentioned, Emily, about a podcast, and, I've seen Allison recording those videos, with our very good friend, Aaron Portzline, after Blue Jackets games. And we're on social media, which I don't know about you, Jesse, but there are days when I wish that Twitter had never been invented. And so we have now this, at first it was an opportunity. Now it's this obligation, and I would say / burden, to put ourselves out in ways that we never had to before. And I'm trying to feel my way through, is this just going to be the way our lives are forever? Or do we morph into another space where we're not in this kind of tumultuous experience every time we want to put our name and face and voice attached to something? Anybody have a thought on that? Eric.
I can speak to that a little bit in terms of, that is something that I think a lot of people don't realize too, because when this harassment does get severe enough where people feel threatened, and I will remind people, you can find information, personalized information, in 10 seconds on the internet. It does not take long at all to find someone's home address or phone number or so forth and so on. And if you, like 10 seconds, it's easy. So that feels very personal and threatening. Usually doesn't mean something, but it still feels that way. And that's what's scary. And I think that, this is the way it is because and so if you went to the police and you're like, oh, help me, they'd be like, well, it's some rando on the internet. What do you want me to do? And, police are not trained to help you if you really did feel like there was going to be a threat to you and your personal safety. And that goes back to, or people tell you, if you complain to someone, they're like, well, just get off Twitter. And it's like, this is now a part of your job, essentially. Like, and even if it isn't a formalized part of your job, because in some places it is, especially as sports journalists, you all might be required by your jobs to have that account, that you have to put that information out there, and you're forced to be open with that stuff. You may be forced to have that presence. You may be forced to interact with comments on your articles or so forth. And I think, first of all, institutions need to be respectful of that and leave that decision up to the individual, whether or not they are in the space where they want to do that, or if there's someone else, or they need to provide services to help people with this. Like if you're dealing with a lot of harassment, there needs to be someone who is there, who is, filtering your stuff so you don't have to see that, or someone who can provide the tech support to show you how to make sure that you are doing what you can to filter out that hostility, because, it doesn't help them as an institution to have you getting, abused on the internet either. So it should be in their interest to do that. But, until we have these ways to make these spaces less abusive, and until there are actual punishments and consequences for this behavior, I can't say that I'm optimistic about things improving. And in fact, it will, whatever the next platform is going to be, it's probably just going to level that up. I do work in VR, and it's like, now you have a physical presence, you have a physical body in a space that can then also be subject to abuse. So, that's something creepy to think about in the future, but sorry not to have a more optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, it's just tough, right? Because I feel like a lot of what I experience online, I mean, I've experienced throughout my life. I mean, the difference is obviously the magnitude, and that there are people that, I don't know and maybe live nowhere near me that can do this. So there's the distance versus the proximity, I suppose. But I don't know that for me, that removing myself from the spaces where, for me, again, especially as a freelancer, me being in front of a camera or having a social media presence is extremely important for me to be able to continue to be a journalist. And so there's that piece. And maybe, again, I don't block people, I don't mute people. Maybe I'm just kind of built to do that anyway. But I think also, I think of going back to the question of, or the responses that a few people mentioned. I know Emily mentioned, having your support system. If it wasn't for social media, I wouldn't know how many other Black women are also covering sports. or hockey in particular. And there's not a lot. I think I can probably count on this one hand. So there's that representation that's extremely important that social media allows someone like me to have that perhaps we wouldn't have had before by just a name. I mean, my surname is unique, and people who know of the descent of North African and how that permeated might know where Ayala comes from, even though it's spelled wrong on there. I got to fix that. Anyway, I spelled my own name wrong. Love it. I didn't put the space, but whatever. The point is that I think that everyone is going to have to weigh the good and bad for themselves, especially women in this space. And for me, I've had to become more comfortable with being on camera. That's not something I like writing, I like speaking, but I don't necessarily always need people to see my face. But I've had to realize that comes with the territory. So for me, it was something that I was willing to change about how I personally would prefer to be seen or not for this. But I do really respect and appreciate what Allison has said about making certain spaces your own and setting boundaries. And I think that's extremely important. There are just certain spaces that I don't use social media, and I don't bring the whole virtual world into. I mean, that's my right as a person, because, unless I was on reality TV, people wouldn't see that aspect of my life. So I think that there are boundaries that are important to set, but I also think that within reason, that there are people that are going to have to find their way and to maneuver around this space. But again, my personal hope is that the more we have conversations like this, that the more people will speak their truth and hopefully recruit some allies, or as Renee Hess of Black Girl Hockey Club likes to say, co-conspirators, so that there's less of a burden that those of us on this panel feel day to day, because either behind the scenes or hopefully frontward facing, we have more people that are willing to say, hey, you might not agree with how they voted for this award, but the way you went about it is unacceptable. And that's really what we want, because at the end of the day, of course, I'm asked to make predictions and I have horrible takes, and maybe I even get into my feelings, and I'm happy to be called out on that. But what's not okay is taking that to the next level, or taking shortcuts and taking cheap jabs just because you think you can.
No question. Peggy's got a question, and Allison, I'm hoping that you might take this in addition to this conversation. She's asking, would it help if athletes, especially famous ones, would weigh in, maybe not, at an active commission, but to be able to just make it, that it's not okay to attack women reporters for personal traits, and, you can critique their sports analysis. But what if this was a movement in professional sports that we acknowledged? I mean, because I feel like we don't acknowledge this. Like, we acknowledge this, and I acknowledge that I'm sitting in a virtual room with like badass women, but it doesn't get acknowledged out in the world. And is that what it's going to take for the teams and the players?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly valuable. I mean, we look at different social issues right now, voting. I mean, we are seeing the success that even female athletes in the WNBA, male athletes in the NBA have achieved, both in terms of bringing attention to the racial issues, as well as a campaign to drive voting registration by signing their names publicly and repeatedly, and using every ounce of public exposure they have to reinforce that message. And I think sometimes, the people we work with directly in the rooms, in the coaches' offices, on the bench, sometimes I don't think they really understand what we see. I've had a couple instances where, a tweet has gone out and someone else does respond or something like this, and a coach will message me later and say, I had no idea people speak to you that way. And I think I will allow, particularly some of the people who've come to me about it, I will allow for recognition that sometimes there just isn't awareness, but which is again why I think lending their voices matters. And I think maybe helping those people understand how to bring it up before it's reactionary, right? A lot of times, because again, this coach didn't know anything until he saw that tweet. And then it's a reaction. versus establishing a standard, establishing it as part of your messaging, as part of what you demand and expect from those in your circles and those who look up to you, I think could be a really great step from athletes, from coaches, from the most powerful, the most widely seen people in our field as well.
I mean, it's such a great point, but Jesse, I have to ask, several years ago, or it's not been that long, but Sarah Spain and Julie DeCaro, two very prominent female sports writers, put a video out, and they had men read mean tweets. And these were unbelievably horrible things. These men were extraordinarily uncomfortable. It got tons of traction. I mean, it was viewed hundreds of thousands of times. It didn't change my life one iota. What would it take to get people to stop thinking that this is an appropriate pathway for communication?
Well, I mean, to be honest, that's fundamental societal change at the core and the root. Like, and as long as there's, inequities and issues that are just in society. So, gender inequities, racial disparities, like all these things just exist in our day-to-day existence, and they just manifest this way online. So, honestly, anything that we can do online to fix things is often just a Band-Aid, and it's like, oh, well, we could, I've recommended filters and so forth. I don't, that's not the best solution. It's just something that can be done because, really what needs to happen is people themselves need to change, and the structures in society that reward this behavior need to change. That said, I do think there are things that could be put in place should systems choose to do that. So, we mentioned, oh, coach is saying this. Well, the thing is, if some player, says something awful and sexist, and then there's just this generic reactive statement, as Allison said, why don't those policies exist in the first place? And why aren't they universal? This shouldn't be something a coach has to decide. This shouldn't be something a team should decide. This should be something that a structure like the NFL should have a policy that says, hey, here's something you don't do when you're a player. That way that if they get, oh, well, my coach yelled at me, I'm just going to trade teams to, the team that has all the, like yucky guys on it where we're all jerks, and that's fine and that's cool, and I'm still going to make my millions. Like, there have to be direct consequences, and there have to be penalties, and there have to be appropriate punishments associated with this behavior. And as public figures, I don't think that's out of line, to like have that sort of thing. They can't endorse certain brands. That's part of their contract. So if that's the part of the case, why can't you just also not be sexist and publicly say things out loud and do things that are inappropriate? But that would also have to expand to other domains, right? How do you deal with NFL players who are out there engaging in spousal violence and sexual assault? And what happens? They win awards, and they assault women in college, and then they just go on into the pros and play and just keep getting all the rewards. And so those are the systemic things that are underlying this entire situation. So that's not a happy answer, but that's the root cause.
Yes. Emily, Joe has a great point here. He's mentioning about at the Browns game, 3 women were introduced as first. One was a coach for each team and 1 referee. And he's asking if you think this is going to help change the dynamic of what female reporters have experienced over the years.
It's so funny. I got a text this morning from someone I know. Allison and I know her, maybe Erica too, but AJ Mlesko, and she's an analyst at NBC. And we were talking about Nick Bonino just got traded. And when she was the first woman to call, to be an analyst on a playoff game, I remember asking Nick Bonino about it. And she said, I'll never forget his response. Like, anytime I see his name, I think of it because he's a good egg. And his response was, that's great. I'm sorry that it took so long. It's disappointing. And I wish there was more. And he just normalized it like that. And I think that's really the word here, is normalizing it. None of us grew up really seeing women as analysts on TV doing play-by-play. There were bylines in papers, and, we give so much credit to those women in the 1970s who broke the barriers and getting access to the locker room. And these guys have grown up with it, but that's what made my job normal. And I think on the TV broadcast, that's the next wave. And we're going to start seeing coaches, strength and conditioning, all the different areas that men once did. Women can do too, and can have great value there. And I'm not saying that men should be replaced. I'm just saying we can all cohabitate because we're all humans in the society. So yeah, I think anytime we get these kind of games like the Browns game last week, it's awesome and we should celebrate it. But I really think what we're celebrating is normalizing it.
And Nick actually is asking, he's actually, he appreciates all of you being so transparent with your perspectives. And he's asking what advice you would give young women who are chasing opportunities in sports that are so predominantly held by men. He cites specifically Callie Brownson of the Browns and, you know, her pioneering of the female presence in the NFL. And we're seeing it across the leagues. It's kind of extraordinary when you think about that we're talking about first in 2020, how far we have to go. So what would you say both for that and then, you know, also thinking about the idea of mentoring young women who want to break into the business? How do we make this pathway easier for the next generation? Allison?
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what Emily said earlier about having that friend, those connections, those networks. I think to the normalizing point as well, you can't, it's often said you can't become it if you can't see it. And so we are finally providing a way for our young women, our young girls to see it. And I think that's so valuable. And then plugging into that energy, it's going to continue to take trailblazers, but I look at organizations like the Seattle NHL franchise, that is one of the most diverse front offices, I would suggest, in all of professional sports. And so seeing these things, knowing now that it is possible, continuing to drive, and then you can start to pursue it as a normal career path, starting to network, starting to find out what education you need. Now it's still going to take some help. And I think the flip of that is, again, building on what we've talked about. And I've gotten to a place with some people now where I can challenge them and say, I'm all for best candidate, but does your candidate pool include people of color? Does your candidate pool include women? All too often we are so comfortable in our circles and it's, I know this person, or even when we throw out a tweet and say, does anyone know someone who's good for this or someone who can help me with this? You're only speaking to your circle. And it is incumbent upon all of us, even us here, even as we talk about having fatigue from the work, look around. Do you have people of color? Do you have people who represent diverse sexualities? Do you have women? Do you have different age groups? Because if you have that, people are going to be able to find opportunity. And also, you're going to avoid so many of these PR missteps we see where something comes out that if you had a woman in the room, she would say, you probably shouldn't put that out publicly. Or a person of color would say, we need to change this language. Or, you know, an LGBTQIA person would say, you're not including everyone here. So I think that providing that space, saying, yes, now we know it's becoming more and more possible, working towards it. And then those of us who are there continuing to make space for more people who don't look like us, act like us, behave like us all the time necessarily, so that they can make their mark as well.
Absolutely. Well, ladies, believe it or not, we are out of time. So I would like to thank Erica, Emily, Allison, and Jessie for being here with us today. This was an extraordinary conversation. This will be captured and put on the Sports and Society website. So I hope that if you had friends who could not make it for this, that you will encourage them to visit us there. Also, please mark your calendar for October 29th, where we're going to spend 2 hours in an evening presentation talking about mental health, student athletes, the COVID crisis, and how all those things have come together in an incredibly challenging way and ways that we can hopefully help people move through that. And if you have topics that you'd like Sports and Society to tackle, we really encourage you to reach out to us at sportssociety@osu.edu. Again, thank you so much for these extraordinary women who are here today and shared their thoughts. And we please keep reading them, keep watching them. And when you're on social media, remember, everybody is a person that should be treated with respect. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.